Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this plenary session that is entitled Speaking Up for Civic Space. My name is Richard Youngs. I'm Senior Fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this session. The C20 has long been concerned about the challenges facing civil society organizations across the world, the way that governments across the world have imposed quite draconian restrictions against CSOs over the last decade. Of course, we know that many of the emergency measures introduced since the COVID pandemic started have worsened this restrictive assault on civil society organizations globally. At the same time, of course, over the last decade, many new forms of innovative and creative civic activism have emerged, and we've seen a growth and a dynamism of global civil society. So there have been very negative trends and very positive trends developing in parallel with each other. The COVID pandemic has increased the restrictions against civil society, but it also seems to have prompted a whole wave of new organizing at community level and a wave of protests led by civil society organizations against government mismanagement of the pandemic. So they're a very complex set of trends, and it is this context that we will explore in this session. We have three very good and knowledgeable speakers to take us through this array of challenges. We will hear from Ricardo Mora, who is co-chair of the Global Call for Action Against Poverty, also a C20 steering member. We will hear from Asif Saleh, who's executive director of BRAC, of course, the renowned development network in Bangladesh. And we will hear from Emmeline Siale, who is executive director of the Pacific Islands Association for Non-Governmental Organizations. We will have a fourth contributor who will actually start us off in a moment with a video contribution. We will hear from Andrés Ricard, who of course is CEO and founder of Fineos, the social networking consultancy. So just to be clear on our aims for this session then, we've asked our speakers to reflect on a similar range of questions, what they have learned from their experiences on the ground of the closing space challenge over the last decade, what kinds of civic responses to this challenge do they think have been effective, how they think COVID is likely to change civil society, both in the short term and the longer term, how they think support for civil society organizations can be built into the funding that will be available for post-COVID rebuilding, and then vitally, what kind of coordination and solidarity at the international level do they think is needed and missing to help foster and protect civil society organizations at the moment. So they're the basic aims that we'll try and drill down to and examine in this session. Without further ado, I will hand over to our speakers. I think we agreed we will start with the video, so I'll ask the technical team if they can please start us off with a short video from Andrés Ricard.
Dear Impact colleagues, it's great to be with you, even though we are just virtually coming together, but it's great to be with you because it gives me the feeling I'm not alone. It hopefully gives you the feeling we are not alone. We are a big community. Civil society is huge. So just to mention one number, there are more than 10 million non-profit organizations out there. So that's great. And it not only gives you a good feeling, it also helps me to stay optimistic. Optimistic in times which are quite challenging. So we are facing a lot of issues. Of course, COVID is there, but all the other issues are still there. So we have climate change, we have inequalities, we have plastic waste. I can continue forever, but I'm pretty sure that we can overcome these problems. Not governments alone can do that. Not the private sector alone can do that. No, we need civil society, we need a strong civil society to work together with the other sectors along these issues, really towards the solutions. And why do we need a strong civil society? Because we have quite unique strengths. Just to mention three. First of all, we have a normative power. We are there to achieve impact. That's something which is special. Secondly, we are able to mobilize people, to mobilize resources. We can work together across sectors. We can work together from different backgrounds. We can work together across borders. So that's something very unique and special. And thirdly, civil society is extremely innovative. Civil society organizations are close to problems, but they're not only realizing what's not going well, at the same time they're developing solutions. So civil society has a lot to give. The question is, how can we unleash the full potential? So how can we really live up to the superpowers we are having? And there are a few things I think we can even do better. So one thing is, let's be proud. We can be proud what we do. We can be proud being part of civil society. And we should articulate that. And we should be also open just to say what we need, for example, resources. Secondly, let's work together. I know everybody's claiming that, but it's not easy to collaborate, but we should do that. We are very fragmented and we should work together between nonprofit organizations, but also across sectors, so private sector, governments and civil society. And thirdly, let's put impact into the center. It's all about achieving impact. So we should be really orientated towards achieving more impact. And if we are doing all that, then we really can live up to our potential. And I'm pretty optimistic that we together can achieve a lot and we can tackle all the issues out there. So thank you very much for your engagement and looking forward to working together with you. Thanks.
A stirring call from Andres to kick us off. He referred, amongst other things, to the importance of civil society's capacity for innovation, which is particularly important, it seems to me, in these unprecedented times, and maybe a theme that our speakers will pick up on. We now hand the floor to Ricardo Moro. Each speaker has about 10 to 15 minutes, which will then allow us plenty of time for an open debate. The audience can submit questions through the event virtual platform. We will then collect the questions and put them to our speakers after their initial presentations. Ricardo, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. To answer your questions about the trend of closing civic space, the impact of COVID, the perspective of the rescue packages, and how to protect also CSO, civil society organization, I would like to start with the C20 communique that has just been released and is available on social networks and on the website. Because this communique that is the result of the work of all the working groups of the C20 and all the work of the steering committee of the C20, led by the Secretariat and the Saudi presidency, that did a wonderful job in putting things together. This communique, I was saying, starts precisely from the issue of human rights and from the concerns on the shrinking of civic spaces. I invite everybody to download it and to read it, and you will see just at the beginning some strong sentences like this one: "Our future is in jeopardy." Trust in governments, science, and multilateral institution is in decline. Peace and justice are being undermined and sometimes humiliated. Civic spaces are shrinking while inequalities are worsening. And there is also a space for hope. The world is not destined to be in turmoil. Inequality, vulnerability, and injustice are not inevitable. But to advance, we must choose cooperation over competition. So I would like to start from this point. During the last decade, we assisted to process of increasing closures of public spaces, of civic spaces, sometimes with outcome of life. We know how many militants, how many people for instance, working or dedicating their lives to defend Amazonas or the interest of the most vulnerable have been killed, even recently, even this year. And listen to what has been said to the video. Doing something like that, that is trying to delete, to eliminate from the public space the voice of social movement, of civil society, is not a way that could help any government to be more effective in sharing prosperity or reaching public goods or whatever. We do think that we are speaking about a fundamental element of our society, of our community, that is all the space of human rights. And if we are speaking about the respect of human rights and the respect of the rule of law, we are considering something that is not creating concern, thinking about the whole world, but it's creating concern also if we look inside even the G20. I want to be very clear on that. We have several governments within the framework of the 20 government creating the group that are not fully respecting human rights, that are threatening freedom, and that are not providing what we would like to have. There is a full respect of rule of law. What do we need for that? I can speak starting from the experience that we have in GCAP and that we shared in C20. GCAP is the Global Call for Action Against Poverty, one of the widest network in the world, trying to gather together diverse organizations and coalitions all over the world with specific priorities while we deal on the perspective of the Agenda 2030. There is a priority on inequalities and poverty eradication. And when you deal with inequalities and poverty eradication, you have to think that at first you have to make everybody have a say, to make everybody participating with a relevant role. So what we try to do is to create a perspective in which the most vulnerable are at the core, are at the center, but not, as I like to say, thinking that we have prosperous nations, prosperous community that are able to deal with the last one, with the vulnerable, but thinking that the communities we want, the society we want to have, are precisely built starting from the most vulnerable, because this is the only condition to have a community, a society that is a home for everybody. And sharing our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities helps us in building communities that can be sustainable and inclusive in the long run. To do that, we need some tools. One tool has been already said during the video, that is using civil society, help sustain civil society to be organized and effective, to provide this dialogue between citizens and public institutions. But then we need something from the institutional mechanism and framework of our communities. That is, of course, laws, constitutions and laws that are providing a rigorous respect for fundamental freedoms. We don't have that sometimes, or in too many cases. Laws on freedom of expression are not really effective, and sometimes are in the paper but not fully respected, and sometimes are even not fully existing. Of course, we need good not only habits but institutional spaces to facilitate the political dialogue. For instance, in the framework of the G20, we have these engagement groups, and we have some spaces dedicated to the institutional dialogue between, for instance, Civil 20, Labor 20, Women 20, with decision makers, with the Sherpas, with the representative of governments. But within the perspective of G20, we can say that too many decisions are still taken behind closed door. But even thinking beyond that, we don't have a good track and habit of permanent dialogue between citizens and government. So one of the calls coming from the society is precisely to increase and to make them as an institutional mechanism, permanent mechanism, in every country, that for the dialogue between civil society that tries to be the expression of citizens and government. Then we need also other tools. For instance, to protect a law on promoting associations. We have sometimes a law on freedom of expressions, but we don't have law that protect association to organize themselves. We need resources, as been already said. This is absolutely relevant. If a dialogue can help public institution in working towards common good, the public good. So we need to help those actors, and again we are speaking about a social movement, civil society organization, and networks to provide that dialogue. And I think that there is also another element that can appear like indirect, but it's not. There is the dimension of education. We definitely need a strong investment on education, because effective participation, an effective dialogue, an effective use of available freedom can be obtained only if people are also well formed, if people received an effective education. Let me mention one last point. The last point is that we can think that we could protect civic spaces using having at disposition good laws, good organization in the social movement, working for feeding this dialogue. But we are also assisting to a misuse of social network. We are assisting. We are seeing public campaigns that are bombing public with messages that are aimed to discredit people working for the most vulnerable. So I think that this is relevant. We know what are the tools used by advertising, by corporations that want to sell their products. But the same tools, even in a more perverse version, are used in politics to influence and to create mainstream that are discrediting who are trying to work for the most vulnerable. I think that as we have rigorous law, we should have, to protect the freedom of expression, but also to prevent, to write false declaration in the press, in the media, we need to strengthen the rules we have to manage also spaces on the net, on social network. This is absolutely relevant because one of the tools used to reduce civic spaces is also the discredit that is fed almost every day by interested campaigns that are going to the net. So for the first round, these are some suggestions that we can share, with the invitation again to read the C20 communique. There is a very good statement that synthesizes all the proposals that have been raised up by the international commitment of civil society within the framework of the C20. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Riccardo, and thank you for offering such a rich array of very practical suggestions, and a very, very important underlying theme of your presentation, which is that addressing the closing space problem is not simply a question of protecting against restrictive NGO laws, but it's about finding ways of positively empowering civil society for the whole range of different challenges that these organizations are facing. We'll pick up some of the suggestions that you put on the table in the question and answer, but now we'll hand over directly to Asif from a very different perspective, but from an organization that clearly has obtained a lot of very, very renowned and practical impact. Asif, how do these issues look from your perspective in general, but also particularly in the moment we're facing at the moment with the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. I think there are, as you said, there are a lot of different kinds of actors in the civil society, right? So one group, I mean, in general, I mean, it works as a check and balance to absolute power and control. But, you know, in this form, some do advocacy, some do activism. And then there are also some organizations like ours who are working a lot on service delivery and ensuring the people at the last mile, at the last tier, the most marginalized and the vulnerable, and the women, they're all treated equally, and look at the more fundamental structural problems of the society so that everyone has the tools to realize their potential. But resistance to our work, not necessarily in the past, has come from governments only. It has come from extremists who didn't want to see women outside their homes. So while that challenge is still there, what we see globally, and not necessarily through our experiences only, but also through the lens of our partners and other actors in the civic space, is that this space is changing very rapidly, right? So, and on one hand, there is shrinking happening, but on the other hand, there's also expansion happening. So how is this shrinking happening? I mean, I would mention the 3 R's. First is through regulations. So I'm not saying that regulations are not necessary, but of course, I mean, in some aspects, certain amount of regulations is important because without effective regulation, that there may be concerns about the governance and inefficiencies of these entities. So in principle, I mean, new regulations purport to strengthen the governance and the accountability of civil society and to assert national sovereignty over the development process. But the problem happens when it's applied very selectively, right? And then that's what we are seeing, that if you, in aspects where people don't like certain entity, the state doesn't like certain entity, and they apply regulations on them in some ways or another. So some are more equal than others. So that's one, the regulation happening, constriction of this space happening through regulation. Second is through retribution. I mean, a wave of closure of civic space has occurred around the world, notably in the last decade, but not all civil society actors are equally affected. I mean, the objects of new restrictions are typically groups and organizations from a liberal and more human rights tradition, right? So I myself started an organization before I joined BRAC, and while I was abroad, because human rights organizations in Bangladesh at that time, they couldn't function because of retribution from the state. So as diaspora groups, I kind of tried to support them through diaspora Bangladeshi community. And similar things we are also seeing that, I mean, in a sense that these kinds of organization, human rights organization, often aid funded. We recently saw Amnesty getting shut down or defunded in India, I mean, as of yesterday or this week. And then oftentimes these are aid funded and with strong transnational links, and as well as their allies in social movements, media, academia. I mean, in practice, however, efforts to regulate civic space are often heavy-handed mixture of a lot of this stigmatization and delegitimization. That they're against national interest, they're destroying the image of the country, all these things, very populist things, and then selective application of rules that I was mentioning, violence and impunity for violence against civil society actors, all motivated by the concentration or consolidation of political power, essentially. So that's the second R. And the third R is the reduction of financing, essentially, and more pronounced post-COVID than anything else. As Ricardo was mentioning, that this work needs financing, this work needs resourcing as well. And what historically has happened is that, while on one hand, funding has gone into more service-oriented delivery, but the rights-based organizations have been, they have saw their funding shrunk over time. And more now than ever before, that they're facing also this kinds of constraint going forward even more, because the whole financing space is shrinking very, very rapidly, because with COVID, everybody is affected more or less. All the donor countries are affected. So they're getting, it's almost like a perfect storm that, not only there are all these restrictions, but then on top of that, you don't have any money to do any of this work. So that's how I see it. But I mean, there is obviously, that's more on the negative side. But on the other hand, there has been wider participation and expansion of civic space in somewhat chaotic manner in the digital space, right? So I mean, the rapid growth of digital public sphere has dramatically kind of reshaped the civic space for all the actors. And this is where we have also, on the other hand, we have seen proliferation of also a lot of right-wing extremist groups as well. So they are also claim themselves also, obviously they're part of the civil society. So that's why I mentioned the word chaotic, because on one hand, there's also a lot of these proliferation happening, there's social movement happening, and the governments are more sort of clearly listening to what's the chatter that is happening on the social media. So on one hand, it's not limited to a few actors anymore. They're kind of hearing the pulse of what people are discussing, how they're discussing, and also retribution is coming on to that sphere as well. But I think it's much more difficult to control that space because there are so many actors, so many people in the social media space. So that has been, in that sense, there has been expansion of the voices, if I can say, but it's also a very chaotic and a noisy space, if I can say. But there are other ways. I mean, you can make things work. I mean, BRAC historically has played a very sort of more diplomatic role in these things, because we have often worked with organizations who are involved in advocacy and others. But our policy has been to engage with governments, because what we do is essentially, as I was mentioning, more work on the ground, more focusing on services, more focused on sort of essentially poverty alleviation, getting people their legal rights at the very micro level, women's empowerment and all that. So in all of those cases, when government sees that actually, in a sense, we do the work, but that essentially makes also the politicians look good, so they're not so much opposition towards that. So there's constructive engagement. So we kind of foster that. And also there has been, I think, examples of how organizations like us also worked with advocacy, rights-based organizations very effectively as well. And I can come to that in a later question as well. So I'll stop here and say and hear from others as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Asif. Thanks for offering such a nice systematic breakdown of the trends, both on the negative and the positive sides. I love your suggestion that maybe civil society is becoming dynamic, but also perhaps a bit chaotic in your words. And perhaps a question we can pick up for the discussion is whether that's inevitable and whether we have to live with that, and how we actually manage to extract the positive elements of that more chaotic activism and reduce some of the negative risks that you talked about. But first we'll hear from Emmeline, just to remind the audience to keep submitting their comments and questions. We'll go straight to the floor after we hear from Emmeline. Emmeline, now over to you.
Thank you, moderator, for the opportunity to give me this space to share from the Pacific. The Pacific Islands Associations of NGO, PIANGO, is a regional platform of umbrella NGOs in 24 countries and territories in the Pacific. So I think that we had heard a lot of discussions around the civic space, particularly in the areas of freedom of association, assembly and expressions. PIANGO is from the region. We are working with civicers in providing them with data on what they have as a civic monitor, which we identify from different reporting mechanisms of the human rights violations that is happening in our region, and we feed that into the global civic monitor of the civicers, which is something that we have seen kind of interesting turn with COVID. And I think that's probably where I will be sharing from, because we have heard quite a good reflections from the previous speaker. But what we have seen in our region is that since COVID-19, a whole lot of interest from our government has shifted to the response to making sure that our small communities are being protected, state of emergencies are put in place, lockdown, and so it has been really good, because many of the remaining countries in the world that has still free from coronavirus are mainly from the Pacific, and maybe this is one of the good thing of being so distant from the rest of the world, that we often find that there's our vulnerability, but in this stage it's like of and I suppose having a small populations, it's easy to manage. But at the same time, we still find that a lot of the civic space that we are now, civil society and social movement are occupying now, is the fact that we have shifted a lot, because we have a lot of our countries depending so much on tourism. And with the lockdown means that is affected. The tourism industry, a lot of job lost for our communities. And so our government are kind of paying a lot of attention to that. But what has come out strongly is that, we have invested a lot of our resources and finances in building that kind of economic development around tourism, around other economic means to keep the economy of the country going. But that has kind of undermined the investing, pay little attention to investment into a social protection system, and so COVID-19 has exposed a lot of our government into that, and so because now that we're kind of moving towards that, paying a lot more of attention into having stimulus packages that make sure that people are still given financial means to continue. Those that has lost jobs are being given a support through their retirement scheme. A lot of the businesses, they have resources put into financial institutions so they can have some way of keeping their business going. our civic space that I have seen occupied in our region is to keep the issue that we felt that is just as important alive. And I'm talking here around, the root cause of some of those um, uh, 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 difficult conversation that um, social movements, groups, civil society, things around seabed mining, for example, the health of our oceans, climate change, those kind of issue that the civil society continue to make sure that that still is still part of the of our leaders and our government's agenda, in terms of don't lose focus on those, because they are just as important. But then at the same time, of course, we see that although that there are certain limitations in movement, no more travel, no more face-to-face meeting, there are political spaces that we often find that there are space there for civil society to engage, are kind of being not there anymore, because the schedule of the meetings seems to be happening online, and then we don't seem to follow some of those meetings. Some of those political spaces has a scheduled timetable in the past that we know how to mobilize ourselves to influence those spaces, are no longer available. Yeah, all of those things seems to be ad hoc and moving at a speed that we don't follow anymore, and the informations are not transparent and are not coming around for civil society to prepare themselves to. So there's a lot of those civic spaces that we felt that is being challenged right now. We also have human rights violation cases in some of the countries that are still under the foreign powers, foreign rules, self-determinations. And I have examples from West Papua, which is still under the influence of Indonesia, our New Caledonia, under France, and some of our Micronesians are still under the America rule. But then we also find that those are our communities and our countries that are under the foreign rules. They are the one that has coronavirus cases, just because they cannot on their own make those decisions to shut down their borders. It still has to come from those countries. So some of those things are the one that we would like to, civil society would like to continue making sure that we voice those issues, so that we don't lose it. We don't lose it when things are being shifted more attention into COVID-19. State of emergency is also an interesting tool where it's supposed to be for the safety of our citizens, but we are seeing that that has been extended during COVID-19, and our government are kind of using that as a way of having the power still under them, and they can do almost anything. And we have seen some of our country using that, some of our government using that, and we have seen legislations review that is related to our land, that is related to election system change, and so and those are the shrinking space that we would like to share. That is kind of civil society is paying attention to make sure that we don't that we keep those issues being discussed, highlighted, so that our citizens and people pay attention, that we don't lose focus and allow our government to continue not having a good dialogue, a political dialogue on that. The other one that I had find it quite interesting is that the way that we have seen the responses to COVID-19, that we have seen our government aligning themselves a lot more to businesses, where all the stimulus packages are going into the bank for businesses to access, and then they are responding in terms of how many businesses are being registered, because it's in a formal system. They're responding to staff and workers who have lost their jobs because they are registered, and they have retirement scheme where they can put funding there to support them. And then we see the gaps that are being more into informal sector. Women's, for example, continue to not able to access. If you are in the informal sector, you cannot access some of those um, uh, support, cash support that are put into bank, because you can't even some of our countries, women don't even have access to land. They don't own land, they don't own property, and a lot of the banking system required collateral. So you see that the divide of marginalized groups, women and young people, disability, are getting far back to where where some of those respondents should be supporting them as well. We have seen the reviving of our agriculture, of our primary industry, that is like our resilience to the cut in tourism, cut in trade, in some area export because of the lockdown and everything. It has created our society to reflect a lot more of our traditional governance, our traditional leadership. And I think this is quite an interesting turn that we have seen much more of a role of our traditional leadership, our churches, our community leaders, that has been in kind of a being regarded as a localized kind of system. And then we had been much more into our whole Western democracy. And so this is a whole lot of interesting conversation going on right now, reflecting more into our culture, reflecting more into our traditional understanding, where things are, how do we deal with relationship in this time of COVID. So I'll leave it there as probably I just want to bring a little bit of how things are in from our Pacific region to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. That last point is fascinating about perhaps a revival of more traditional forms of governance. And it's true that so many of the more established democracies have not performed well during the pandemic. So perhaps one of the longer term consequences of COVID is that there will be more of a debate about what are the most effective systems of governance. Perhaps there will be more of an open debate around those kind of issues. You've all been very disciplined on the time, so we have plenty of time for questions and comments. I can't see questions coming in from the audience, so I'm not sure technically how this works, but perhaps I can start things rolling by putting one question to the three of you, which is this. You all draw out the tension that the pandemic is requiring CSOs to address emergency health issues, often organized at a more local level, focus on urgent service delivery requirements. But there are, of course, still the longer term rights issues and issues of social inequalities that are not going away. If anything, they're being reinforced by the pandemic. So CSOs have to juggle with this balance between the short term emergency and their more traditional longer term concerns and objectives. My question is this: do you think that the pandemic is a kind of definitive game changer for civil society? Will it require civil society fundamentally to change the way it works and engages with states? Or are we talking about more of a kind of short-term emergency that does require adaptation on the part of civil society organizations, but that eventually CSOs will be able to go back to their more traditional sets of concerns and ways of working. Is this a fundamental change, or is it a very serious but kind of momentary pause in the traditional work of civil society organizations? Ricardo, I don't know if we can perhaps start with you. You mentioned some of those tensions in your opening remarks. It'll be interesting to hear your reflections on this question. Ricardo?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm writing something to try to remember what I should say. It is a difficult question, and I'm not sure I can answer properly. I don't know if I have the answer. I even don't know if there is the answer. I think that one interesting thing has been said by I'm sorry, I'm very bad with names, but by Asif, when he said that civil society is evolving, even in a chaotic way. And I think that this is true, and this is normal, is a sort of constitutional feature of civil society. Civil society is the expression of citizens. Citizens are alive. So you can't think that you can force in a static, not moving, not changing framework or model the way a citizen can express themselves. And I think that civil society, in a way, reflects as well this mobility, this flexible, this life of citizen. Having that, I don't know if COVID will change permanently, but definitely COVID is providing a strong impact that has a consequence on this sort of permanent evolving way of life of civil society movement. And we used together the formula, not only civil society, but also civil society and social movements. That probably reflects more this flexibility, and also the last intervention was precisely in that dimension. I think that we've been called by this question, in fact, by this concern, when we were trying to organize online with a lot of other international networks, even in dialogue with UN SDG Action Campaign, the one that is based in Bonn, that works a lot with civil society to provide, to try to make the Agenda 2030 well known and more familiar with everybody. We tried in the first part of the year to organize online mobilization, to show concern, to show awareness of the crisis, solidarity, and whatever. We received also some reactions from our national coalition based on the ground, saying, "Oh, listen, we don't want online calls or whatever. This is not useful in this moment. We need to understand the way to show that we are close to the people with the concrete actions in order also to help the people to express themselves." And so I think that this crisis helped us not in reaching a new definitive way or model to act, but in questioning ourselves. And I think that this is interesting, and this can introduce a second consideration that we were sharing, for instance, for who attended that. the previous panel. I was in another panel before, and we were speaking a lot about the legitimation even of civil society organization. We are questioning the government. We are denouncing the reduction, the closing, the shrinking of civic spaces, etc. And we'll still continue doing that, of course. But we have to consider also if we are doing enough. We are doing what is really needed to be able to make the most vulnerable at the center, the most vulnerable to have a say. I always repeat this issue. We in GCAP, but it is not something that is done only by GCAP, of course, but we still repeat this issue of the most vulnerable because it is absolutely relevant. The risk also for us is to create a sort of smart elite speaking about the fight against poverty, whatever, but remaining in an environment that can be attended only by people who receive the opportunity, who benefit of opportunity. In that sense, I think that is important to question ourselves. And again, I don't have the last answer to that question, but to integrate ourselves, asking ourselves if whether we are able to call on board everybody, if we are able to be really at the service, if we are able to be not speaking on behalf, but to be together the expression of all citizens and of the most vulnerable. I think, and this is the last consideration for now, I think that this is something that not only has to do with the capacity of civil society to speak with the most vulnerable, to involve them, to be really inclusive, but also you were referring, Richard, to the health answer to the crisis, to the COVID crisis. Either we are able to organize health systems that are that start from the ground level, the grassroots level, providing a presence of a public, I always say, robust public health system everywhere in our territory, or we won't be able to face crisis like that. Probably in the future, the situation we faced this year could be repeated, can be repeated. If we have the capacity and the capability to organize an health answer that is based on the ground, and it's not the expression of a high-level institution that can provide a high-level service, but without the capacity to reach everybody on the ground. This is exactly what happened in many countries during this crisis, and it's the reason of the development of the death in several countries. And if we are able to do that, yes, okay, we'll be able to face this crisis. If not, the danger will be again in front of us. In that sense, there is a role also for civil society to be able to provide a dialogue on the territory, on the ground level, between public institutions and population and citizen. Now, I think that this is a strategic element. I mean, civil society is not only providing political messages, advocacy, or mobilization. In a lot of cases, is providing also services. So we need an intervention from the state, but civil society can help in make the intervention of public society, of public institutions, meeting the people. In that sense, probably have a perspective also of evolving and evolving, our way to be active and to organize ourselves. These are just some suggestions.
Thank you, Ricardo. Asif, would you like to comment on this question?
Yes. No, essentially, sorry, remind me of the question one more time. Can you hear me?
We were talking about this kind of long-term balance, or how the pandemic will affect kind of long-term identity of civic activism. Some of the issues you were mentioning in your presentation between the short-term and the longer-term underlying issues, also that Nazmin was talking about.
Yeah. So I think in a sense, the society, I mean, the civil society, if you talk about, the development sector in general, I believe it was ripe for some level of disruption anyway before COVID. I think COVID is going to fast track that. So it may not happen right away, but it will, the process has already started. Because I think clearly, I think what we are seeing on the ground is, as you both have mentioned, that the needs are much greater, right? The inequity is more than ever. I mean, and as a result, so the needs for organizations and the civil society's engagement with government and also provide services and others and the community outreach, that's even greater than ever. But the resource is much less. So we have to do more, but we have less. We have to do more with less. So in a sense, that means it will fundamentally, we need to change the way we work. And particularly while the COVID is there, until the vaccination comes in and it gets distributed, that's, if you're looking at least 1 year or two. I mean, there's also the fundamental challenge of mobilization. I mean, I think one of the big work that we do on the grassroots is also basically work with people, gather them around, talk to them. We have schools, we have our healthcare workers going door to door. So we are having to rethink all of that. Now, again, as I was saying, that that would require innovation, that would require bringing in technology, and we are seeing that the infrastructure is not there. It's much more expensive. I mean, we are not being able to capitalize on the social capital as much as we would in the past. So, so essentially, it is forcing us to rethink everything in a sense. How we do our delivery, where we work, what sort of partnership we need, all of that. So I think that's fundamentally the other thing. That is, so doing more with less means that you have to leverage each other much more strongly than ever before. So you don't duplicate the work. You actually need to figure out how to complement the work. Try to work with the government more in a constructive engagement without losing your independence, obviously. And also in a sense where we need perhaps behavior change and other issues, as I was mentioning, that we need to, as a whole, we civil society also need to be able to utilize the digital space much more effectively. Because like it or not, it's out there, it's people accessing it, people are using the content, but it's not necessarily being used the way it can be maximizing potential. So I think that's where also, in a sense, somewhat more the newer, voluntary, younger actors who are coming in, they are being able to use it much more effectively. So we have to be very savvy with digital media as well. And last but not the least also is that I think the civil society has to be relevant with the society and changing needs. I think one of the things that has happened is because of various foreign funding and other things in the past, there has been a sense, and in the country where they operate, it's been this like that they are disconnected from the population in some ways, and also at the same time their accountability is less with the people, more with the donors. So that misperception needs to be broken, and then the way to break them is that you become much more innovative into solving emerging problems of the society, effectively communicating with the people what you're doing, and essentially also building more sort of engagement so that people feel that you, as an organization and civil society, you're actually also accountable to the people that you work for. So that also, that fundamentally revisiting that relationship, the power dynamics, all of this needs to be rethought of, because it's it started with one thing, with a virus, but it has it's upending a lot of things because of financing constraints and other challenges. Thank you.
It's very interesting. I see, for what it's worth, in the research we've been doing in Carnegie across the world, looking at the impact of the pandemic on civil society, the very same observation keeps coming up time and again, that in a way the silver lining of this pandemic is that it is pushing many civil society organizations to kind of look down and engage with their local communities, perhaps more so than they've done for a number of years. So that's very interesting that you bring that up. Emmeline, on this question of the longer term impact on civil society, and in your presentation you were saying that in your part of the world the virus hasn't been quite as overwhelming in some other areas, so it has led to an adjustment. But if I understood you correctly, there are also the longer term, longer running, more traditional concerns that also people are trying to keep at the top of the policy agenda.
Thank you, and I think for me, just a quick add, because I think that the two speakers before me had covered a whole lot of areas interesting from the Pacific. What I've seen is that because there has been a time when we find that there are restrictions in civic spaces, and we have taken a lot of some of the solidarity movement to the global level. Yeah, we had been engaging with some of our partners at the global level on climate change, for example. Community loss and damages discussions on climate financing, relocations of our communities because of sea level rising. Because we have not been able to have those kind of conversations with our government, we have taken some of those cases to the global platform. With social movements and others that are supporting at the UN level, for example. Because of COVID, what I have seen that has changed is that I have recognized civil society are much more having a little bit more empathy to our government in terms of when it was locked down, state of emergency, at that particular time, everyone has been like looking into our government to lead us in such a pandemic that we had not come across that before. And so I have seen a lot more of empathy from civil society to build a citizen trust in our system, in our local system, and that has changed the way that I have seen the relationship between civil society and government. I have seen a lot more of our civil society groups coming together to work collectively than ever before, because of how we all seems to be, okay, let's all get together and try and find ways to deal with this pandemic that we have no idea how it will roll out, and even now, although that we had a lot more of understanding for informations available to us about the coronavirus, the economic impact of that is not going to be over soon. So it has changed the way that I've seen civil society, but at the same time, it has also questions in terms of funding. And I think one of the points that was earlier made is that we are more aligned in the past to have much more of a better relationship with our donors and the financing of the work that we do. A lot more of what I've seen now is that we need to see government investing local resources, financing civil society work, so that we see how our accountability from our own means can trigger down to our community and build that whole ownership around finding better way, finding solutions to what we see now in our region. Thank you.
Very good points about local accountability. I'm going to select 3 of the questions, very good questions that have come in from our audience. We haven't got too much time left, so I'm going to select 2 of them and put them to the speakers, who can perhaps just choose one or quickly answer both of them. And then we'll wrap up with the 3rd question separately, because it has specifically to do with the C20. So I have a very thought-provoking, very tricky question from Claudia Fernandez from Gestas, who asks, who is actually afraid of civil society? Who is actually trying to restrict the space? And she suggests that we need a good understanding of where the threats are coming from in order to understand what are likely to be the most effective responses in pushing back against civil society restrictions. A couple of you made the point that the threats often are not coming just from governments, but other actors as well who are seeking to limit the space for civil society. So that's one question from Claudia. And then Jesus Menendez Vicente in the C20 has a question about the rise of digital authoritarianism and whether in the context of digital authoritarianism, there is any scope for civil society organizations to work more hand in hand with the tech companies to protect civic space and make more of a positive contribution to civil society freedom. So one question about the roots of the the attack on civic space, and one question about the digital dimension and whether alliances can be built between CSOs and tech companies. Who would like to start us off on this? Should we run perhaps in the same order, Ricardo?
Yes. I think that actors afraid of civil society do exist. And they are not only in the government, of course, but they are among the people, organizations, institutions, use the word you prefer, that are benefiting of specific privilege in this moment. And that will be, of course, affected if things can change, if we have policies able to improve the life of who has less in this moment. Yeah, so this means that there will be a lot of economic actors that share this fear, this negative prejudice against civil society. I think that this is a really short perspective, because if we improve the quality of life of everybody, probably will benefit everybody together of this change of improvement. But anyway, yeah, I think that there is something like that, and this I think that can provide us a link to the second question, and the second question is related to authoritarianism, as you said. In the digital dimension. And I was mentioning something like that at the beginning when I said that there is a misuse of digital spaces, of social networks, etc. And I think that this is a real challenge that we have in front of us. We live in a society that, as Bauman was saying, is every day more liquid. So traditional structure are less existing, if not over. And this way, it is even easier to meet people, but it is easier to meet people online for short time. It is relatively more difficult because it is getting out from the habits of people to have permanent links, to have a well-structured relation. This is happening also for civil society. So if we are thinking about how civil society is remodeling its way to act, I don't think that it is changed or can change in the future the role of civil society. Maybe that we can change some way, some tool, as someone already said during this panel, using more some new for instance, digital tools. And yes, this means entering a dimension where manipulation is absolutely easy. I think that yes, some alliance with tech companies, I think that improve our skills in occupying also electronic spaces is important. I think that this can be done also with alliances. I think that this can't substitute anyway the real dialogue on ground. But anyway, I think that it's not just to follow, to try to compete with who is misusing those digital spaces. I think that anyway, we need an action. We have to call on action governments to approve law that really respect human rights also in the electronic sphere, in the digital sphere. I think that this is important.
Asif?
Over to you, Rick.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
I would just add, I think Ricardo has covered most of it, but I would just say that the tech, as I was saying, that we need to work better with technology, whether it's come from in the form of tech alliances or just doing our campaigns better, to understand making contents, digital campaigning. So essentially, going back to the thing that I was saying, that how do we communicate to the people effectively for the cause, and at the same time to create a broader sort of alliance of the willing, if I can say, because I think in a sense you in this space where oftentimes populism is running amok, liberal sort of actors are easily vilified in the name of nationalism. You need to, as civil society actors, we need to be much more savvy in terms of building our own political capital with the people. And essentially, I mean, the digital media is where people are now. So that is changing opinion, changing perceptions, influencing policies. So definitely, we need to be much more savvy, understand the media very well, understand the newer media, where people are, their different age groups. So I think that will play a much bigger role going forward in terms of how effective our messaging is, how we are connecting with people, and how relevant we are, and are we being able to build up the capital so that if our space is constricted, then more and more people outside our own sort of stakeholders, they're going to come out and talk about it, so that governments across will feel the pressure to not do that, because I think that's the only way to exert some pressure now with these various nationalist governments across the world. Thank you.
Emmeline, do you share that assessment from both Ricardo and Asif, that there's a kind of untapped potential there to explore tech alliances to make the digital sphere work a little bit more in civil society's favor?
Thank you. Before I comment on that, I think just one other comment that to the first point, which I had seen in our region, that it has now than ever before a push for civil society to look at our own accountability. Yeah, because we are now looking far more in terms of calling on government, calling on private sector, calling on every other stakeholders, donors to look at things to build our society back better. It also put a whole lot of pressure on civil society ourselves, in our system, in our processes, making sure that we are more accountable to ourselves and accountable to our constituencies. I think that's my additional points to the first one. In terms of the digital sphere for civil society, unfortunately, it's still in untapped industry to our region. We still have communities that are not accessing to IT, and even if they access, it's not affordable compared to other parts of the world. But then at the same time, what we need to see more is that we're selective of what are the audience that we want to use those digital platform for, because we know that some of our policy makers still prefer to read policy submissions on papers, and obviously what we have seen that is can be used to the benefit of civil society, is mobilize campaign, mobilize people, articulate ideas, but then in terms of influence, we still have to be selective of which the best way to use, because we still find that there are situations where personal relationships, understanding, having context into some of our campaigns, some of our things that we want to see change, often still require the traditional way of doing things with people, having dialogue, having face to face. But then, so my point is that we don't use one over the others, but just choose which tool to use in terms of what kind of influence that we want to see. Thank you.
Yes, if I was to put my small grain of sand to the debate, I would say that the challenge in the future is to make sure that the offline and online tools work in tandem together rather than being seen as kind of competing tools of influence for civil society organizations. We don't have too many minutes left, just about under 10 minutes left. So I saved till the end a question from Diane Schumann, who's at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, who asks very specifically what forums like the C20 and other official forums can do to react to the current crisis and themselves be made more inclusive of some of the newer innovative forms of activism and more practical in their impact. I guess this is perhaps a natural question to go to you, Ricardo, as you've been thinking through your communique that you mentioned and what the C20 strategies might be for the future. And then perhaps just to wrap us up, I would ask an associated question of my own related to what the C20 and other forums can do, which is, as you mentioned, Ricardo, in your opening remarks, some of the governments, including in the G20, themselves haven't had a particularly good record on civic space, on the pandemic. Many would say they've been part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The bigger powers we know, including some of the bigger democracies around the world, are subject to quite problematic trends in this regard. It makes me think, where is the leadership going to come from? Where is the international leadership going to come from? Maybe it isn't the bigger powers, maybe it's some kind of constellation of smaller or medium powers that can actually help back up civil society and the efforts of civic actors that we've been talking about in this session. So 2 questions maybe to wrap us up just briefly. What can the C20 and other similar forums do? And where can we look for kind of stronger international leadership in favor of civil society? Ricardo?
Always they seem a simple question, but they aren't. I think that we are in a permanent effort to improve the capacity to include everybody. this year has been very tricky because we were expecting to have physical meeting, face-to-face meeting in the path of the C20, as we traditionally did in the past. Then the pandemic forced us to use a different way, a different tool, that is this online meeting. This probably helped more people to be part of the process than in the past. And thinking about next year in Italy, I represent G Capitoli in the steering committee with colleague Stefania Burbo, and we, with other Italian colleagues, are preparing the work for next year C20, that will be hosted like G20 in Italy. And we are thinking about the experience that we did this year under the lead of Saudi friends, and thinking about also some limit of this tool, because the digital tool is fantastic, but if you don't have power, or in this case, for instance, if you don't manage English, doesn't help you in the participation. But anyway, I think that what can make more effective all the tools that we are using is to be all connected, and connected in the perspective that we all share, and you will find in the C20 communique, that is the international dimension of multilateralism of United Nations. G20 should be at the service of the United Nations dimension, with many other organizations of civil society. Probably I've already mentioned it. We have the opportunity to organize the so-called People's Assembly, and we are doing it again at the regional level and at the local level. I think that we have to multiply opportunities to speak each other, not pretending to find a model or a big network able to include everybody. This is simply not realistic, but making a permanent effort to speak each other and to share opportunity to dialogue. This way, we can feed a sort of mind of culture, and we will be more active. This is a partial initial answer, but I think it's important. Sometimes even among us, competition can exist. So this kind of coordination is really important.
Thanks, Riccardo. Sorry to be rude to cut in. We only have 3 minutes left, and apparently we get cut off very abruptly. So Asif and Emmeline, just final, perhaps just a minute from you each on this kind of practical, this issue of practical suggestions for the forum. Asif?
Yeah, I think, the forum can be a great place to bring different actors together, both national and international level. And as I was mentioning in my original comment, that there are different types of actors. I mean, I have examples of BRAC working with Amnesty with the Rohingya refugee crisis as well. So we played one role in terms of providing support, but then Amnesty came, they were working on the other side, on the right side. So we together, I think we can make this happen. But essentially, I think the original point of the greater need of a strong civil society across the world and having an open society, I think there needs to be a broader conversation about that. And if we also bring it to make it to more specific issue-oriented cases, I think that's also going to be very powerful, which C20 can does, which they have already started doing, but make it more sort of tangible, more action-oriented. I think that would be a great role for C20 to play.
Okay, great recommendation. To finish us off, last word, Emmeline.
Thank you. I don't have any additional comment. I just endorsing what being said already, particularly when it's this kind of conversation need to happen at all level, at the country level, at the regional level, before we bring it out to the global level. There are conversations happening that can make sense and contextualize to our own context, and then we can make sense of that and hold our government accountable in those that are making decisions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our four speakers. We just have a few seconds left, so it remains for me to thank Ricardo, Asif, and Emmeline. It's been very instructive listening to you. By way of a very, very short conclusion, what I've heard is that you are all facing a lot of very difficult challenges, but also there's room for hope, and there's a lot of new dynamism, a lot of new ideas in civil society that have surfaced as a result of the pandemic. For what it's worth, it seems to me that we're at the beginning of a long process of adjustment, and that these kind of questions are questions that we will need to revisit, as you were saying, Ricardo, in the year ahead, as civil society grapple both with the new restrictions they're facing on the one hand, and some of the new opportunities to play a more significant role also present themselves on the other hand. So from me, thank you to the audience for listening. Thank you for the great questions, the people submitted questions, and to our three extremely insightful speakers. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good evening.